Yeah, Lord, we thank you for this day and for Jenny's work and her experience vocationally, her experience in her own life, and her passion for this subject. And we pray for you to just um, free her to be able to communicate and share the fruits of her labor. Thank you that we can be here together today um, and offer this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So, Jenny, this chapter appears in a book on Torrance and Evangelical Theology. Um, do you identify yourself in Australia as an evangelical? I'm just wondering, because we have a sense of American evangelicalism right now, so I'm just wondering, as somebody who's writing this contribution, how do you see yourself vis-a-vis the Australian context of whatever evangelical theology might be there?
Oh, that's a tricky question to answer in some ways. There's definitely, and this is partly because my background is far more centered in law and in that kind of interdisciplinary space than necessarily the background theological space. So if you were to ask, someone like David McGregor or someone like Andrew Jutney or someone like that, they'd give you a better answer. But I certainly would say that evangelical here, my understanding of that word is a lay understanding, right? So not a formal, more doctrinal answer, but it certainly is really different. Well, I'm an outsider to the American understanding too, but it seems to me to be quite different from the some of the streams of evangelicalism that are occurring in the States. Over here, I've almost had to clarify with colleagues about no, evangelical is not a denomination that automatically believes a bunch of really restrictive things and really othering things about people and stuff like that, because we do see that in some places, I think. But the church that I'm involved in, that I grew up in, was interdenominational. And so I don't have a lot of denominational loyalty in that sense. So for me, evangelical is more about that idea of what it is that you believe and why, and centering on, literally the good news kind of thing, and trying to, it's not automatically a belief system, but an attitude that you bring to what it is that you are seeking to understand about the God who has revealed himself in the person of Jesus. Yeah. So, it's not about believing that, all you have to do is read the word. What is it some people say? The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it.
Yeah.
And I think I understand what people probably, mean by that in terms of the weight that we give to the scriptures and the respect that we bring to them when we read them. But I remember when I first started looking at the work of the Torrances, which I think was in the late 90s, first time Baxter came out here, someone made a comment about, and I think you'll know this, I think everybody in the room will know this better than me, but I think it was Bart originally, who was kind of, wouldn't be originally, would have got it from elsewhere, but Jesus is the word of God, right?
Yeah.
So I don't approach biblical interpretation as something where it's just about reading the words, particularly when I'm reading them in English, and I have not studied Hebrew, and I cry every time there's a word in Hebrew or whatever, because Torrance uses it quite extensively, right? And there isn't necessarily a nice little English translation. We need to be careful about our exegesis and those kinds of things. I don't know how well that answers your question.
Well, we're locating on you as much as anything, because in this chapter, you are an advocate for a form of thought that arises from the Torrances and is attempting to translate that form of thought into a world that for most of us is another language, the language of justice systems.
Yeah.
And so to recognize that your intention is to bring a kind of thinking about the nature of who God is as proposed by
Yeah.
the Torrances, and that it matters in this world, and therefore to look for points of connection, and maybe words get actually enriched, deepened, pushed in places they wouldn't have been used before, so that
Yes.
we're growing into the conversation. So I just wanted to locate who
Yeah.
you are and what you're doing in that conversation, and just to acknowledge that we have our inadequacies stepping into the world that
Oh, we all
that
do.
you are, in a sense, taking us
Um,
into. So
Oh, look, I think, and I mean, that never stops, does it? You know, I mean,
no,
I teach legal theory, but I draw very heavily on, lectures given by a colleague who's probably one of the top 5 legal theorists in the world, and I've got access to some of her recordings, and so I give those to my students instead.
yeah,
I could tell them, but I'd rather they hear it from her. But I think where I'm coming from in this chapter, I was really conscious that the word evangelical is understood differently in different countries.
yeah,
And I was very, very conscious that a lot of ideas about justice and a lot of ideas about domestic and family violence, and I mean, that's a term that gets used, there are different terms for it all over the place, but I was really conscious that a lot of these teachings have been just completely weaponized
right,
in the hands of people who've got very, very unscriptural and unchristian, in my view, understandings of what it actually means to particularly to be a husband, or whatever else, and it becomes about power and control and domination and things like that, which, irrespective of your understandings of what submission means and where mutual submission fits and all of that stuff, I think everybody in this space is agreeing now that those things have been twisted, and then used to justify any number of things, and that there's a lot of doubling down, I think, when we approach the position of Christians in the world and what's going on with the gospel and questions like that from a position of fear and trying to hold tight to what we have. There are a whole lot of discourses that are saying we need to fix everything by getting back to basics, and the basics are that men are the boss, and scripture doesn't say that, but that allows for authoritarianism and dominance and control to all of a sudden start defining how we are meant to treat each other. And
it depends how much you cherry pick verses, taking wives
absolutely. I mean,
submitting without the wives submit to one another, and other things like that.
well, the Bible used to be used to justify slavery, and still is in some places. So it's all about twisting scripture. It's not actually the truth. And so trying to unpack that in a way that doesn't just look as though I'm yet another woman turning around and saying, please don't oppress me using the scripture, because by definition, people won't necessarily listen to that if they think that my voice doesn't hold any weight, or whatever it might be. So I thought, well, and what really, I think I might have said this before, but I'll just repeat it in case I haven't. I just found the work of the Torrances to be, so freeing and so foundationally changing for me when I first started looking into their work, and therefore reading the scriptures differently, because the Torrances' work isn't about them, right? So it pointed me to Jesus and to truths about what's actually going on in the Trinity that I hadn't realized before. And the church that I grew up in had didn't have a minister for a while, and then it had different ministers, and then we wound up with a Baptist minister. And the Baptist church is different here than some Baptist denominations there. It certainly wasn't a far right kind of very, very conservative, but certainly steeped in a traditional, evangelical understanding of scripture. But there were all kinds of things that I hadn't come across before in understanding the profundity of what the person and work of Jesus has actually accomplished for us, right across the spectrum of human experience. And I'm not a science person at all. And me
I think you
trying
have
to
legal science. You have a legal scientific
Oh,
mind.
sure, legal science, but I'm not a science person at all. And so the irony of me trying to read what Torrance was writing about, Einstein and Polanyi and everyone, was like, I was ringing all the physicists I know, just going, help me.
But
But
legal science is another metaphor. I mean, Brighton has just put up the onion of Bart, Torrance, Jenny, justice, domestic violence. Each one, in a sense, informs a context for the next piece that goes down. And that would imply at some level that the nature of all of these are a focusing in of scientific thinking that deals with the nature of what is and investigates through others who, in a sense, give us guidance into those areas as scientists do. So what you are
sure.
doing is highly similar to and lived in the context of other scientists, but you're bringing it to unique contexts. So
Well,
you've
I
got to
kind of had
stop
to.
discounting yourself
Oh no,
and
I'm not
acknowledge.
discounting myself. I'm not discounting myself at all.
Okay.
I think I had to look at the Torrances in the context of, all right, what does this mean for law? What does this mean for law? Precisely
Yes.
because I don't know enough about science to try to jump into the science and theology interdisciplinary stream. I wanted to be interdisciplinary about it. I kind of
Yeah.
had to, but I didn't, I didn't have any choice but to draw on what I know. And it started pointing me to ramifications for relationality and justice and things like that kind of straight away, and I latched on completely to the covenant and contract stuff. Especially, this, Marty, I latched on to the covenant and contract stuff straight away because someone said, I don't know what JB's talking about, because I
Can
don't
you see
understand
that
about contracts. Tell us.
can you see that that's more scientific than the system of the atomizing of people living under justice with the individual in their dualistic, separated out from life? Covenant is
Well,
more scientific in a sense, right?
uh, I
Because it's
think it's,
holistic. It's what is instead
yeah,
of
I mean,
the broken apart.
well, I think the thing that I really enjoyed about the covenant, I mean, I won't spend the whole session talking about covenant contract, but the thing that really struck me when I started getting into that was to realize that because contracts, by and large, and I mean this, I think I put this in the notes, this is the very potted version, but because a contractual way of being and thinking and relating and structuring things is dualistic. It has to be to fulfill its function. That's how that operates. And so everything that JB said about the importance of covenant and contract, the ramifications of all of that pastorally, everything that says about the way that it twists how you see God and all of that, all of that is something that we need to take into account. So all of TF's work in terms of his epistemology and his theological method and all of that, and especially his cautions about dualism and how you effectively lose the gospel because you're separating out who Jesus is from what he doesn't, all of that stuff, all of TF's cautions about dualism were picked up on and used, and it's seen through JB's work as well. So they were actually both on about the same thing in that sense. And I mean, and so it allowed me to see more clearly some of the ramifications of what TF was doing because I'd had that entry through the covenant contract distinction.
Now, would you say that the nature, you have your foot in two worlds kind of here? I mean, there is a world that is quote unquote attempting to affirm justice, but they deny God as the one who undergirds that. And so you could say that necessarily they begin not dualistic by virtue of not acknowledging the nature of a God who covenants with humanity, calls for community to covenant with one another in ways that are the outworking of his love. So when you say justice in the courtroom, I don't know how Australia is, but there's a sense in which any theological logic is generally not accepted, and it's somewhat consistent with the problem that TF has with personalism, is that it's human beings thinking about person without the divine component in. Therefore, everybody gets their opinion. In this case, justice. Everybody believes in justice. It just happens to be that everybody believes in their own version of justice, in which it works very well for them, right? And the secular, because they leave God out, makes it all the more problem. And therefore, Torrance felt like science did the best job with Polanyi and Einstein of actually having a holistic science, and that most of what you might call the social sciences, which I don't know if you call law a social science or not, but that they all still are all fighting for dominance over one another because they won't submit to the one who is the creator of justice itself.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of interrelated issues there. And I mean, happily for my thesis, I didn't have to jump into too many of those because it's written for Christians, but I think TF's cautions about dualism and the need to be having an approach to or an understanding of reality where ontology and epistemology are not separated, and where we have an onto-relational understanding of so many things, really, that in itself, can bring an understanding and a perspective that's really, really needed, because the damage of dualism is there, whether the people believe in the Christian God or not. And so, and there's a lot of movement in jurisprudence and legal theory and things like that, and probably in other disciplines too, but thankfully I don't need to know about those. But there's a lot of movement towards holistic understandings and drawing on knowledges which are not dualistic, precisely for that reason. And so there's a lot that's in law, and that there's a lot that's in legal theory, and even in the justice system, broken as it is and flawed as it is, that does actually pick up on these holistic concepts, and that does have compatibility, for want of a better word, with Christian understandings. It's our lay understanding of justice that makes us think, oh yeah, that's about punishment, and which therefore sets up this kind of dichotomy of the Christian response is forgiveness, which therefore rules out calling the police or looking at questions, because that's about punishment. And you can't be having somebody that you don't want to be punishing them if you want to be forgiving them, and seeing those as fundamentally inconsistent. That kind of split doesn't actually have to happen. And so the justice system has got concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation and reparation and restoration and all of those kinds of things woven into it. But a lot of that isn't immediately apparent for people who are not already involved within that system. And of course, it is really, really flawed. And I say that as someone for another few days anyway. I've still got my practicing certificate, so I'm someone who sits within that system, and I will afterwards anyway. But it is very, very flawed. And I will say too, and hopefully, I don't think I put this in the chapter because there just wasn't room, but neither my chapter nor my thesis itself is trying to say that women should always go to the criminal justice system. Right. Plenty of people decide not to for plenty of very, very valid reasons. All I'm trying to do is make sure that one of those reasons is not because they think that it's unchristian to do so.
So could you take this to a church or a gathering of pastors and say, I think I have some issues we need to think through. It's a real issue in the homes of the people you sit with. And, I'd like to facilitate a conversation and have an outcome where the role that you have in equipping, training, working through both proactively, in other words, preventing abuse, but also in restorative kind of ways, when abuse happens, that we would have vehicles of doing some of what it is that I think you're pointing towards. How would you feel about doing something like that? And isn't that kind of what you're aiming towards? That you really want pastors to...
Yeah, I have done a little bit of that, and there's certainly more on my list of things to do after I do the other things that are on my list for this year. But there's a whole lot of stuff that waits for submission. July is coming. It's okay. But there's a massive amount that's actually happening in this space worldwide. Just a huge amount. A lot of churches, not all churches, but a lot of churches have been incredibly active in this space. And there's been an understanding that we need to take an integrated approach to pastoral responses to DV. And so there's more collaboration between churches and human service, DV services and support services and so on. And a lot of that is getting really intentional. It's not uncommon here to have DV services and trained staff come in and run programs for pastors and leadership and things like that. So there's an awareness that pastoral responses need to be more trauma-informed and need to be involving referrals. There's more of an awareness that DV is not an anger issue, that it's not an ordinary marital issue, that the couple just need to get counselled by their pastor and that's the solution. There's a lot of awareness around that. And so really all I'm trying to say is, hang on a minute. In all of this integrated collaborative effort, if we add to that an understanding of what's actually happening with this in this DV situation, and that it does involve issues of justice, and that violence itself has an onto-relational impact, right? And so it's an onto-relational injustice, and these things actually need to be dealt with, and won't necessarily be dealt with by the DV support systems. So rather than subsuming, because of that sacred secular kind of dualism, rather than assuming that the pastors will deal with the Christian stuff and DV services will deal with everything else, let's actually remember to be intentional about including justice system considerations and justice itself as we work through that process, because absolutely your DV services will be across justice system stuff, or some of them will anyway, depending on who it gets referred to, but they are not aware of or trained in the pastoral or spiritual side of these things, right? So the churches are trying to stick to their purview by not talking about stuff that the DV services are talking about. But justice is actually part of that, and justice does have a theological component. And so they can actually speak into that space and keep and bring their expertise on that. And so intentional partnership on those justice issues is important as well. Yeah. So that's, I suppose, part of the point that I'm making. But in order to do that, we need to get back to we don't want to do that with a theology that says, well, it's actually okay to mistreat your wife, just don't do it too much. And the pastor will tell you off when you do, and then you just keep going in the relationship. We need to.
Tim has asked the question, what does auto-relational injustice mean? And I want to frame that in the context of a pastor gets a call, this man has been beating his wife. And so you're thinking, and I want you to translate, how does he think about the situation differently if he's thinking onto-relationally and the kind of justice that he brings? So domestic violence, the phone call is because an event has happened and somebody's stopped it or whatever, and the pastor is called, and he's been sitting in one of your seminars, and so he thinks, I need to think onto-relationally about bringing justice here. How does a pastor think in that space in a way that answers the question that Tim is asking? What does that mean?
Yeah, good question, Tim. Thanks for that. We've just gone 6 o'clock here, so I can answer that.
Tim's at the other end of the scale over in Ireland, so we've got the Irish.
All strength to you, Tim. Look, I guess what I mean when I say that justice or that violence operates in an onto-relational way is that we can't separate out the personal impacts of that from what we might think of as the obvious impacts of that physical damage or whatever it might be, although DV involves a lot of other things. But it affects
it might be the wife, it might be the kids.
Yeah, it could be anybody, but
the neighbors.
Could be the husband. There's so much of that, and it's so hidden, and that's a really, really important conversation to have. But what I mean when I talk about it as an onto-relational injustice is because of the effect that it has on people's personhood and sense of self, and the way in which you know yourself, what you think about yourself, and all of those kinds of things. And so it's because of that, the corrective to it needs to operate to address all of those levels as well. Yeah. And so, and we need to bring if we're looking at the theological component of it and how we ground our theological responses to it, then those need to involve more than emphasizing forgiveness out of place, rather than considering it within the context of the whole of the gospel message. And the gospel message is primarily about, in this context, the dignity and the safety and the personhood and the depth of the wrong that has occurred, because it is, of course, a relational wrong as well. Yeah. And addressing those things together as part of bringing restoration to whichever person in the family has been affected in that situation. But I mean, my research is about husbands and wives. So bringing that...
Everybody's affected. I mean, your onto-relational means
yes.
It's never just one, it's everyone.
No.
If it's an elder abuse or a child abuse issue, the other kids are terrified, and if it's the elder person maybe feels abandoned or doesn't want anybody to show up because they don't, I mean, maybe they're trying to protect the one even that's abusing them. It just becomes systemic at some level. That's the echoes of the onto-relational injustice, right?
Yeah, and I think probably in terms of, what would I say to that pastor? There is a lot that I would not say to that pastor, precisely because I'm not trained in, I'm not kind of a stand-in for a DV support worker, right? Yeah. Or a social worker or a psychologist or whatever else. So there are nuances and layers pastorally to what would need to happen in that situation that need to be worked through really, really carefully. And but in my view, taking an integrated approach to it, theorizing domestic and family violence holistically, and understanding it as involving that kind of onto-relational injustice, and seeing that the levels of that, and removing the dualisms that are kind of woven into the way that we respond to it, from the some of the legal theory kind of right up through, because the Western legal tradition comes out of the Western Christian tradition, right? So a lot of the dualisms that are woven in philosophically have made their way into some of the structures in how we think about what the law is and so on. And I think that's part of why we think that the law is just about punishment, or criminal law is about punishment and so on. But so I wouldn't dive into most of the layers, if I'm honest. If I wouldn't dive into all of those layers. Yeah. But what I would encourage the pastor to do would be to not approach this issue dualistically, not to think, okay.
You wouldn't say that to him, dear pastor, don't approach this dualistically. You'd say something else that makes more sense to a pastor who hasn't been trained. What language would you use? We're waiting for the language that you would use with the pastor, not with the philosopher.
I would encourage the pastor to not see the justice issues here as outside of the pastoral response, and not see the the questions about what needs to be done for safety, vindication, restoration, those kinds of things, as less important than forgiveness. So I suppose in a sense I would encourage a conversation that would allow those barriers to engagement with the criminal justice system that I talk a bit about. And what I tried to do in the handout was kind of give a potted view of what else is in the chapter besides the handout pages, right? But the two main errors that we make are to think that DV is first and foremost a spiritual issue, but which means by definition we need spiritual responses to it, which means we overlook the secular, or that the secular have come much, much further down the track. And the other is to sort of carve off the different responses, pastorally, and overemphasize forgiveness, and approach it as the kind of the appropriate response is forgiveness, and to jump into that in a way that's usually profoundly unhelpful. And if we understand forgiveness covenantally, and if we understand forgiveness in an onto-relational way, and Mike's done some work on this too, then, you know, we don't lapse into a legalistic and transactional understanding of these doctrines, which kind of, you know, just, okay, well, you need to apologize and you need to forgive, and then off you go. And, you know, don't do it again, and we'll monitor you and make sure you don't do it again, but now everything's fine. There's a lot more going on than that. And plenty of churches don't operate that way with it, but a lot of people do, or they're not sure of how to bring these things together, and you know, how to bring a sense of justice and restoration. So it does involve a different understanding of the dignity and worth of the persons involved, and the way in which to restore those different levels of harm that have occurred. And
I want to bring Bryden in here. He's had his hand up there. So go ahead, Bryden.
Bryden, how are you, mate?
Oh, look, well done getting up so jolly early.
Oh, it's all right. I've got my coffee. I'm all right.
You're right. For me, as a pastor, I mean, I've been a pastor, a full-time vicar, I've been a part-time vicar, etc., etc. I have to ask a very simple question, which is kind of so simple, we don't actually do it often. Who is it that's sitting in front of me? What is it that's sitting in front of me? Not quite the same question. And it's so stupid to even start where I've just started, because a person is what? Well, we think as Westerners, well, they're an individual, aren't they? Well, yes. And I think what Torrance, both TF and JB have done is that they've actually done what is lurking in so many of the social sciences and other disciplines. And you talk about the holistic thinking, and I've thrown up some naughty comments just to be provocative to see what happens. And holistic thinking comes in various forms, just as individualism comes in various forms. And the person in front of me is in a whole network of relationships. Some are primary, and I'll use the jargon, some are secondary. But they're in a web of connections of greater or lesser intensity. And as I even begin to use the word forgiveness, you were so good a moment ago when you said, oh yeah, I forgive you, I apologize, and then we carry on as normal. I mean, you know, it's ridiculous. Let's move on. Well, actually, hold on a moment. So what is it that's actually in front of me? And what is it in front of me is actually multi-layered, multi-dimensional, multifaceted, and it is complex. And, you know, in your enthusiasm as a 26-year-old curate, you're not a 70-plus-year-old pastor anymore. You know, it's kind of cute, isn't it? So thank you so much for using the language onto-relational, but it insists that that individual in front of you, the husband or the wife, is actually far, far more. They are a package deal, if you want, to be really crude. They come multidimensionally, they come interconnectedly. They are, and I deliberately, you know, use the German sense of one is not. They are integrally a package deal that says, hey, slow down here. And unfortunately, that is not the assumption of so many Western pastors or Western legalists or whatever you're saying. Our premises guide us. I played with my glasses a couple of weeks back. You know, Marty, take your glasses off and on. Come on, get on with it. That's it. Absolutely. You're blind as a bat now. I know. and we are blind as a bat if we don't realize we're all wearing inner glasses, inner spectacles. So thank you. I mean, there's a whole lot more that you're on about, but I wanted to bring it explicitly to the surface. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Bryden. I think that actually speaks quite well too to the whole question of how how is this kind of response different from a, you know, starting point as a pastor, etc. And as I said, there is a lot that I wouldn't advise a pastor on, because that's not my skill set. But one of the questions that I think we have to rethink at that kind of ground level, because I suppose where I'm starting from is more the undergirding level, right? There's a lot of people on the ground who are trying to take on integrated practice and trying to incorporate all of these different layers to their services and so on, but there's a lot that hasn't been theorized in it. And one of the questions that I kind of keep coming back to is, well, you know, what has happened to this person as a result of this violence? Which is why I think understanding the whole way that injustice works as an onto-relation, or having an onto-relational effect, is important, because when you do that, when as a pastor or as anybody else, if you're sitting there talking to someone and thinking, okay, well, who is this person that's in front of me? We are starting really profoundly with an understanding of that person's personhood and being and primary relationship, in that sense, if we separate it out that way, as being, you know, a child of God, right? So again, the husband and wife research that I'm doing, you know, a wife's identity is not actually first and foremost as a wife. And if we're taking a contractual understanding of things, and if we're taking a legalistic understanding of things and separating out different doctrines from the faith and giving primacy to some and not understanding them as integrated and using a unitary framework as the Torrances would, then the most important thing about her could become the fact that she's the wife. And, you know, the marriage, and this happens a lot, you know, the marriage is prioritized over the safety of the people in it and the well-being of the people in it, and so on. And so then it becomes, well, you know, okay, what we have to do is do what we need to do so that this marriage can continue, rather than, and I mean, sometimes the marriage will continue. I don't look at that either, because that is going to be a question that is answered much further down the track once many other steps are taken. But if we start with, you know, recognizing this supposedly individual person that's sitting in front of us as not getting her identity from her relationship with her husband in the first instance. I mean, we are who we are in the context of our relationships. So yes, of course, all of them are a big part of being constitutive of our personhood, sure. But all of that flows out of our participation in Father, Son, and Spirit, and who we are actually, who we actually are within that relationship first. And so that changes everything about how we understand what the wrongs are that have been done and what the harms are that have been done, because violence is something that attacks your sense of self, and in an incredibly profound way, whether it's physical violence, sexual violence, other violence, emotional abuse, whatever it might be. And so that changes everything in how we approach what actually needs to happen here. And the Torrances didn't write directly on violence. TF gave a radio address that was turned into a little journal article. But everything they say about, you know, covenant, everything they say about mediation, everything they say about what it actually means to be human now is relevant here, because it's that kind of harm that occurs. And we bring a different truth from a pastoral point of view, let alone a legal point of view. We bring a different truth to bear to this when we understand violence in a different way than just, oh, okay, the problem here is that this conduct has occurred, and so now we have to smooth that over, make sure it doesn't happen again, so that you can get on with this marriage because that's God's destiny for you, you know.
Right. Which the chapter of your title, Seeking Love, Justice, and Freedom for All, if you're thinking out of the nature of the triune God, you are seeking, but what you mean by love and justice and freedom are different than if you're a lawyer who, you know, processes divorces or domestic violence situations or whatever. The very nature of those words are different. So to just recognize that the TF and the JB piece, they're really informing how we even understand what love, justice, and freedom even might mean, so that we can operate in the different mode that you're talking about. And it's as different as moving from Newton to Einstein, which was Torrance's move, that we're not just seeing things in parts, but we're seeing things as a whole. Or if a doctor says, yeah, we're going to work on your heart, but don't worry about the rest of your body. We're just going to focus on your heart. We're going to open you up and all that. It's like, well, what about anesthesia and all that? We're just going to focus on the heart. We'll let all that other stuff take care of itself. It's like, I don't think so. I'm a whole being. You can't just cut me open and do something to my heart without making sure you've seen the whole, right? And that's the holistic dimension that's there. So
Yeah,
the word
I mean,
covenant, here in the States, the word covenant is another word for contract. I live in a covenant community means the community I live in tells you what color you can paint your house, what you can plant in your yard, how light your dog can bark in the yard. It's a contract. It's all the prescribed things that you must do or else. Right.
Yeah.
So people, even with the word covenant, in the way you're looking at it, I think most people here, at least, you'd have to really back up and say, we need to talk about what covenant would look like so that love and justice and freedom actually can be informed by something that is comes from the nature of who God is and not merely another echo of
Yeah.
a legally based culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's that that quote, love, justice and freedom for all, seeking love, justice and freedom for all, was taken from part of JB's model. And I think part of the beauty of that is that that was where in his work, he extends a covenantal understanding to questions of injustice. And quotes from the Kairos document at one point where he says, love without justice is sentimentality. And so we do actually have both. It's not an either or, and the gospel doesn't, well, he didn't write it this way, but the gospel doesn't choose forgiveness rather than justice, because a covenant, a theological covenant, is, certainly between God and humanity is one-sided, because everything is fulfilled in Jesus, right?
Right.
But even in terms of covenants between people, it still involves a relationship that is unconditional and is grounded in love rather than law, etc. So I think pretty much everywhere, at least everywhere Western that I'm aware of, covenant and contract do mean the same thing in law. They absolutely do. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it's literally just a nice fancy legalese way of saying contract, right?
Can I just quickly interrupt?
It's all through property.
Sorry.
Too. Sorry, Brandon.
In South Africa and Zimbabwe, I studied naughtily, you don't know this, economics and law originally. Oops, sorry to confess it.
It's all right.
You are married in community of property. That's a legal principle of Roman Dutch law. You are married in community of property. Now, I find that intriguing in the context of what you're trying to do here, because there is a seed within that principle of jurisprudence, going back to why that law, why that form of law, that says the parties are not actually individuals anymore. They are in a form of onto-relation, to use the language, that the law now recognizes. And Roman Dutch law is not the common law or back up, Braden. It's not the civil law that's now morphed in most Western cultures, because the idea of commonality was deeply rooted in Anglo-Saxon common law. Hence, everybody's rights to graze their animals on the Anglo-Saxon common, village common. So we have to be very, very subtly careful as to what we're actually generalizing. Sorry to be so specific, but you quote Kairos, you quote JB, because they did a lot of work on South Africa as well, as you know.
Yeah,
and I'm sorry, I'm partly Zimbabwean.
Yeah,
there we go. Sorry, mate, to interrupt. Go for it.
No troubles at all. I mean, it's a really important point that you make, and it's made by TF for that matter. He does not see a marriage as a private relationship.
Yeah.
And I think I put this in the handout, that one of the dualisms that is really important in most Western countries is that, and certainly and it's gotten into the Western legal tradition a bit, but it's coming out now, thankfully, but is that public-private. And that's become so difficult because we don't actually want to interfere in someone else's marriage, right?
Yeah.
And yet for TF, and I would say JB too, and DW for that matter, but certainly that position of no, the marriage is a relationship that is lived out within the church community, and we've got that. We're meant to be supporting each other in our marriages, and we're meant to be, and we're accountable to each other in the whole of our Christian life as part of discipleship, right? Within that local community, there's that difference too, I think, in understanding the way in which marriage works. And yet we're socialized so often in terms of our Western Christianity to see the marriage as the private relationship. And so therefore we don't actually want to tread on those. There must be two sides. Let's just not get involved in their dispute. They need to sort it out. Even the term domestic and family violence, right? We locate it within the domestic sphere. And traditionally, historically, and the impact of this, because it's come from the Christian tradition, has been that the law didn't actually go into the private sphere. The law was in liberalism. The law is in the public sphere. The law did not go into the private sphere, which is why we had that whole phrase of a man's home is his castle. And that's why the wife and children belongs to the husband, etc. So we had all of that tradition. Now the law has moved away from that. But there are aspects of Christian belief in some places that haven't, and it's very, very deep within our thinking to start with those categorizations of separation, really, rather than understanding that we need to move from a completely different position and starting place, in a covenant. And I don't know. I should ask Alan about it, but I partly wonder, and this is a complete conjecture, right? But I sit there and I think, TF wrote all this stuff about covenant, wrote about marriage and, all of that, and didn't say a word about what happens when there's violence. And my suspicion is, well, I mean, firstly, that wasn't what he was actually trying to set out, because he was trying to talk about what this means for us in terms of understanding who God is and who we are, right? Marriage was an example in that. But the other thing is, well, if marriage is a covenant relationship properly understood, rather than legally understood like it can be here and can be elsewhere, then that involves unconditional love. And that involves self-giving, and that involves preferring the other, but not in the sense of, having to serve the other because they're dominant or anything like that, but having that mutual concern for one another and all of those things. And I mean, I see that, and I'm a single person, right? But in that kind of relationality, a wife is the last person that a husband would even dream of treating badly, let alone violent. It's the complete opposite of how a covenant is to operate. It is literally unthinkable to the gospel to treat someone in a violent way because of who they are and who they've been made to be in Jesus, right? So it's completely outside of a covenantal model. And so, a man who engages in domestic and family violence, whether that's coercive control, emotional abuse, right through, is in a fundamental breach of his marriage covenant. It's done. That's just that.
I think
now,
the point there,
what
though,
happens
is
with that down the line is different, but that is how fundamental a breach it is.
Yeah. We don't teach what a covenant is. I think people get married, they say their vows, they throw away the vows. They don't recognize the promise dimension of covenant is something that you are saying to another person, personally, I will be this to you. I will be faithful and true. I will love you and cherish and support you. But those, they're said on a day and then thrown out. So part of it, the church's lack of really doing the preventative medicine side, so you're just problem solving, like hospitals where people say, I'm not going to go until it gets bad. It's like, well, you know what? A stitch in time saves nine. And if
Yes.
our marriages were better articulated, you're coming into a marriage probably from a family that's different from you, and they did things different, and your family may have been abusive. And if you don't pay attention to it, guess what you're likely to end up doing? And that can go both ways. Or you just were never taught to do anything, so you default to silence, which can be its own kind of abuse. Or you get tired of it all and you decide to leave without even having a conversation because you just couldn't. And that's a kind of abuse, the abandonment issue. So there's so many different forms that could open the door for the church to say, we don't want justice to be just how we clean up the mess. We want to actually give you tools to not fall into those places and to identify the seeds of domestic abuse and to be able to invite people in. We want people who feel safe, who you could say, I get angry or I get frustrated or whatever, and process through those things so that it wasn't after the abuse had happened. I mean, just don't you have a sense that there is a huge part the church needs to do in training and equipping in the covenant? I mean, I just think of I think it was JB who first said, we have made the 10 Commandments 10 things that we easily turn into a contract. But a Jewish reading of that is that I am the Lord your God who's rescued you out of the house of slavery, out of the house of bondage in Egypt, that God has already promised to be and acted in a faithful way for his spouse. And the things of, now don't go after other gods and spend time with me, and all those things are the outworking of that love that are unconditional, but they're clear too. I mean, we need covenant thinking to be clear about what does that mean when you enter into a marriage. And don't just default to the way that you were raised, because most of us come from dysfunctional families, right?
Yeah. Well, I think,
If you
and
watch
this is
TV,
where,
it just makes it worse.
yeah, I think this is where understanding those other aspects of the unconditionality of covenant and where it comes from within the context of the whole gospel actually does enable, as JB said, love and justice to be held together. And righteousness in the Old Testament doesn't incorporate love and justice, right, within its understanding of what it means to act rightly. And a lot of understandings of law do actually incorporate a loving response as well as a just response.
He has shown thee, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires thee to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. I mean, I think there is an integration.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think part of what we miss in covenant, quite apart from its the unconditional love bit, and I think you and I were chatting about this once, Marty, I don't usually come to this group, but a few sessions ago, we were talking about the fact that even JB's understanding of covenant as unconditional love can get weaponized, because then you go, oh, fantastic, now I can just do anything and she has to forgive me, or whatever. Whereas JB's model, the reconciliation model that I draw from, situates the responsibility to bring justice in any situation where there's been harm. That is located on the person who has done the harm. And so their unconditional repentance, right, is demanded of them too. That is their covenantal obligation.
Yeah.
And that involves reparation, that involves restitution, but the responsibility for that is located there. Whereas quite often, if you're looking at things transactionally and you're focusing on, forgiveness as the key thing that we have to make sure happens, because we focus on forgiveness and grace, right? In particularly in Protestant churches, it's all about forgiveness, and most people don't acknowledge their violence either. So the model of, well, he said sorry, so you have to take him back, doesn't work either. So, oh, well, you have to forgive him anyway, and we'll work on him, but you have to forgive him anyway. No. The responsibility to bring justice in that relational sense, even leaving aside the legal system, rests on the party who has done the harm. And any kind of reconciliation requires forgiveness to be received in repentance, which is what can potentially create safety. But because this responsibility to bring justice and do those things sits with the person who has committed the harm, that then frees the woman from the responsibility to try to patch all of this up and keep going no matter what. And attention can be given to her restoration and her well-being and her worth, because she doesn't have to be the one who kind of sorts everything out and keeps going. And if we're bringing, a deeper and a more complete understanding of various aspects of the gospel to it, then the fact that justice is not left out is itself profoundly healing and profoundly restorative, because the primary word to this woman, to get back to Bryden's comment before about who is this person that's sitting in front of you, the primary word of God to someone in that position is not, oh, sorry about that, but now you have to forgive, and the primary word of God to that person is, this should not have happened, is a denunciation of that violence and an affirmation of their worth and who they are as a child of God. And because of that, here are the things that that we're going to do to ensure that you are safe. And it's a different starting point.
I wonder if it can push you beyond that, even to say, who am I as I sit before you? In NATO, if one is attacked, we're all attacked, and so we all respond to try and restabilize and all that. So
Absolutely.
for a pastor to be outside of that situation is in a sense still maintaining a dualistic, I am separate from you, this is your problem, married, and we're trying to decide, instead of saying, I am part of this. I can see JB going. I mean, you have stories of him meeting people on the beach and then going to the house and praying with them, and he was not bashful. And I think he really saw himself as part of every family, and that in a sense he was a gospel called person to enter into it, because who I am is the covenanted God's person in this moment and place.
And local churches, I think, are designed to operate that way. If there is violence occurring in the church, and let's be frank, there is violence occurring in every single church, right? And that is everybody's business. That is not just the business of the couple. That is actually
we don't see it. So, I mean, I hear you say that, but the fact is we don't see it. But Tim's comment,
we don't
the church,
see it. We don't see it.
The church is a dysfunctional family, and so it is there.
Well,
and with inadequate safeguardings, but the safeguard is that we don't know, right? That's the safeguard. As long as nobody knows, all is well.
Yeah, and I mean, and yet I think you're using that phrase ironically, because it's no safeguard.
Exactly.
It's a safeguard for those of us who don't want to see it and don't want to think it and don't want to know it. It's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. But statistically, I'm speaking statistically, of course, it's in every church, and that's I think part of the problem there too is because we're using the phrase domestic violence. And what we mean by violence isn't just physical violence or sexual violence. It includes, this full spectrum of conduct. And so we think, oh, well, as long as we're not seeing anybody walking around with bruises, and as long as the wives aren't coming and complaining to the pastor that they're being raped by their husbands, then we're okay in this church, but statistically, that's not the case. And of course, most wives, to digress a bit, if you don't mind if I digress a bit, most wives won't go to their pastors and complain that they're being raped by their husbands, because a lot of people grew up being taught that they have to have a sexual relationship with their husbands whenever their husbands want, because that's what marriage is, and that's kind of the deal. And they don't understand that there's actually no obligation there, because that is meant to be, again, a relational. And it sounds obvious when you say, no, that is meant to be a mutual, beautiful, relational thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are taught, well, no, submit to your husband. This is what it's about, etc. Very, very damaging teaching. And so a lot of
consent.
people wouldn't even think to say that to the pastors.
Doesn't covenant include consent?
Sorry?
Doesn't covenant include consent? Consent is
What do you
it's
mean
a
by that?
willingness. Well, I mean, in the United States, everybody says, I mean, this is true even at the university campus, if there isn't consent, you shouldn't be doing it. So the ethic is both people have to mutually agree. And in order for it to be determined to be rape, somebody was not consenting. So to say in the context of a marriage that if you have a covenant, I promise never to rape you, I promise always to have your consent that we have sex, would be to live within a covenant of love and respect, which JB's word was dignity. We always must grant the other their dignity, which means I listen to what they are willing and not willing to do or to have or to be. And I respect that by granting them their dignity. So at some level, in the context of a church and the context of a marriage, the language of, what are we trying to get people to think? You're not granting your wife or your husband the dignity of having a conversation to find out what we can consent to, what we can't, and being in the conversation. Because part of the covenant relationship is that you stay in the conversation and don't just default to a power struggle, right?
Yeah, I want to kind of put a pin in that for a sec, Marty, because there's about 6 different points that you made there, and I think they're important ones. But to start with this issue of what JB said about dignity, part of what I'm kind of trying to pick up on in that is that an experience of justice is actually part of what gives that person back their dignity. And he also speaks about it as being given back your humanity, and in an unconditional covenant and in a covenantal response to harms, that it's that the giving of justice from the perpetrator is part of what gives the humanity back to the person who's been harmed. And so, a loss of dignity and a loss of sense of self, and this is why I would say that violence has an onto-relational impact, because it affects our sense of who we are and things like that. And so that restoration of dignity and viewing that person in light of their dignity, leaving aside the fact that you love your spouse, right? But
one would hope,
given their dignity, it would be unthinkable to treat them in any way that tramples on that, including in a sexual relationship. So maintaining that attitude of dignity and respect for their personhood is an ongoing and moment by moment thing in a covenant. So I think I would not say that a covenant, well, I would say that a covenant involves consent, but I would not mean by that saying I do at the altar means I consent to have sex with you whenever you want, right? And that is a fundamental misinterpretation of what personhood is, what dignity is, etc. And that was actually what enabled a doctrine for hundreds of years of rape in marriage, because it was legally written in that once a woman married a husband, the marriage vows constituted her consent to have him as her sexual partner. So it picked up on the exclusivity of marriage, right? But because she had chosen him, and of course there were lots of arranged marriages, but people ignored that bit. She was now given to him as his sexual partner, and it was against the law for him to have sex with anybody else. That's out in the public sphere, right? That the law reaches. But her consent was given to him, and the doctrine was, well, and she has given him consent, and that consent cannot be revoked. And so therefore the law didn't recognize any such thing as rape in marriage. Her consent at that point became moot. But we need to distinguish between a legal understanding of consent and the fact that a sexual relationship in marriage is meant to be mutual. And because it is meant to be mutual, you do need consent every single time.
You have two questions.
Because because otherwise you've depersonalized it and you are using that other person for your own sexual satisfaction. So so I wouldn't say that covenant involves consent in the sense that if you're married to somebody, well, that's it, because that itself would understand covenant. And I don't take you to be meaning that, Marty, because the next thing was dignity and respect, right?
Yes, exactly.
So
every single time.
We're holding those things together. But I think it's a really important point to make, because it's literally how the church got it wrong on this for hundreds of years. And it was only in the 90s that a lot of countries, including Australia, that the law even caught up. And in a lot of places, the churches haven't caught up. This is why so many people think that David was an adulterer. You know, David was not an adulterer. David raped Bathsheba. He was the king. Everyone had to obey him. There was no issue of consent there, right? So,
he recognized that his guilt was an acknowledgement that he was guilty. There are two questions for you in the chat there. One from Tim, which kind of has two parts. Jenny, are you saying safeguarding is a cover for abusers, preventative of abuse, and below cover or excuse of abusers? And then there's one by Brighton you can go to after that.
Yeah, I think when we were talking about safeguarding, there were kind of two potential understandings of how that operates. You know, I mean, I see the fact of if we are starting from this integrated unitary framework and this more holistic understanding of the gospel, and I'm with Bryden, by the way. I don't actually like my choice of the word holism there, but I just mean non-dualist, right? I just don't like trying to
use the words systematic and systemic. I use the words systematic is breaking everything into parts. So a systematic view of marriage takes each room of the house and the laws for that. Systemic sees everything together. So to say your body has systems, but you have to treat all of them. You can look at one part, but you always have to recognize the whole. So what you're doing is holistic and dualistic. I do systematic is the broken apart dualistic, but it's more than dual. It can be many parts. And systemic is seeing the whole with parts that all have to work together. So that's my variation on your words.
Well, I think, I mean, even TF, he used the phrase dualism quite generally, you know, and was referring to any kind of dualism where we're separating things out and we're seeing them as necessarily separate and not automatically having connection and so on.
I have to explain it a lot of times to people before they get it, though. So
yeah,
sometimes he uses the term a lot, so it's like, yeah, here's how I understand it. It's like, oh, that makes so much more sense. We'll do that. So anyway, it's the language that we try to keep saying. Now, how can we make it more and more clear?
The language is important. But yeah, clarity, I think clarity is important too. If you're talking to a contract lawyer, they'll understand what dualism is. But I think the conversation around safeguarding, I think goes hand in hand with the idea that yes, you know, a couple's marriage is personal, absolutely. And some aspects of that are absolutely their own business, right? Okay, it's personal.
Personal mean private, or does it mean personal as in made up of persons?
I was trying to use the word personal, you're right. I was trying to use the word personal so that I didn't have to say that some aspects of it are private, because it's not private as in secret, right? It is lived out in community. Right. Okay, and so I think a safeguard there can, if we understand that marriages are the health of marriages and the well-being of the people in them and all of that is everybody's business, because we are actually, you know, we are living in a church community, right? And so of course there are aspects of that we will treat with respect and honor, but at the same time, if we are aware that there's a level of accountability to each other simply because we're living together as a family of faith, right, then that in itself can provide a safeguard, because it's not the case that we would expect that we can treat people how we want at home and then show up to church in a nice flash suit. And I've seen this happen. You know, someone who dresses in a nice flash suit at church, and so everybody and raises their hand in worship and says amen in all the right places. And so we assume that that person is really faithful and therefore they must be treating their family well. There's a safeguard if we know that discussions of these things can actually be on the table when they need to be. And so being more open about it, speaking from the pulpit about it, and creating a culture in which we actually reject treating each other violently and treating each other in a way that is not in accordance with covenant, whether that's in our marriage relationships or in our other relationships, we're still going to be treating each other, recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of the people in front of us, and creating a culture of safety right across the church. That in itself becomes a safeguard. Whereas if we think that, well, we don't talk about people's marriages because they're private, I mean, and we don't want to talk about those things.
Walled off, the
that
walled
in
off
itself
darkness.
does provide a cover for abusers.
Yeah.
So it depends on the approach to, the fullness of the gospel in this area, and it always comes back, to how we understand personhood and what that actually means for who we are within that particular community, and that the justice system, the criminal justice system, if we are rejecting that sacred secular, the criminal justice system can be part of a faith response to violence. It's in one of the research projects studies that had been reported that I was reading for my literature review. There was a comment that was made by a wife, and she said, if a man punches someone on the street, then he'll just go to jail for that. But if he punches his wife at home, then she'll get asked, oh, what did you do to provoke him? And we sort of assume, or there has been this tendency to assume, that one is the business of the law and one is not. Now, the law has moved on, but I think we struggle, partly because of this private and public divide, we still struggle with that. And in the church, it's harder to know what to make of that space. But I think a culture within a church where we treat each other with the dignity and respect that we are due as beloved children of God, and we have an attitude of service and well-being towards each other, if that's our overall kind of posture towards each other in our church community, then any form of mistreatment that anyone is getting, no one, you don't bully people, you don't go and punch the person who jumps in front of you for in line at the coffee, and if you do, we would expect the police to be called for that, if that's what the person wants. And in the same way, if there's that kind of treatment going on at home, that is also our business, and there will be a holistic response to that. And no, your wife is not the one person you can get away with treating badly. Quite the opposite, actually, because you've chosen to dignify and respect each other and build each other up as the people that you are created to be in Jesus.
It's the rights and responsibility. It's the responsibility balance. The person who says, I'm married, I have the right to do whatever I want, instead of, with every right, you have a responsibility to care for that person and those others that are impacted in as well. So we've become such a language of rights, we've lost the responsibility. I want to direct you to Bryden's question that we haven't yet dealt with. Need to make a distinction. What is consent but another expression of autonomy? You can speak to that. Whether we are free to drive down the road because we all obey the law. Freedom is already relational rather than an individual transaction. So thoughts on that?
I think so. I mean, I think freedom has to be relational.
Yes.
Because we exercise it in the context of our relationships, including our social relationships, and this is where, I haven't talked a lot about the law, but this is where, written all through the fabric of how the law is structured, right, it all came out of, and I mean, it was dualistic, but it all came out of, that kind of social, in Western legal traditions, that social contract, right? We have laws that are there for the greater good of people. And we have laws that will actually enable people to flourish and thrive to different degrees. And of course, there's lots of, political theories around the extent to which the law should and shouldn't regulate things. But fundamentally, freedom needs to be exercised within that context. And I think and yet even ideas of rights can be weaponized, right? So you can turn around and say,
without responsibility, they are. Literally with guns. The right to bear guns is literally a weaponizing of rights.
Yeah, and overlooking personhood, I think sometimes, particularly if we are disconnecting some teachings from within the gospel from other teachings, which is what I mean by being dualistic and legalistic. So there's a dualism that operates there, and then there's that legalistic contractual understanding of what those doctrines are. If we disconnect them from one another, we can turn around and say things like, oh, hang on a minute. Now that you're a Christian, you have to be the servant of all. You have to prefer everyone else. You have to give yourself away. You have to lay down your life for someone, right? So you don't get rights anymore, and I can treat you however I want, or I can manipulate you into things, or I can whatever. And so I think, but if we are understanding rights and obligations and the that overall responsibility to treat one another in a way that is just, and treat one another that in a way that affirms their dignity and those kinds of things, then rights doesn't become something that gets weaponized or a word that we all have to be afraid of or whatever. And we can find that kind of middle road there. I mean, I think I mentioned at the start about the fact that my research is very much in relation to heterosexual marriages and legal marriages, not de facto, because that is the tradition that has grown up through the church, and that's where a lot of these very damaging and twisted around doctrines and all of that stuff have come from, in that context, right? So that's mostly where our research is. There's very little research in relation to domestic violence against husbands, but it certainly happens. I've put a few percentages in the handouts. And theological teachings get twisted there as well. And men who are experiencing domestic violence, I think, have an additional barrier in that if we are seeing, manhood and being the traditional husband or the biblical husband as being the big, tough, strong leader who protects his household and from outside threats and all the different things that it has grown up to mean, then by definition, he's meant to be big and strong. And so surely he wouldn't be experiencing violence. And so there's that stigma potentially that can come in there. But scripture can be weaponized against men as well. I mean, I know someone who he was, physically able and all of those things. And yet his wife turned around and said, well, Ephesians says that you are to lay down your life for me as Christ, laid down his life for the church. So, this is how it's, and was incredibly emotionally abusive. And people think that that's, far less dangerous, but in actual fact, emotional abuse is typically what leads straight to lethality. And she would say to him, one of these days, I'm just going to kill you in your sleep. And so the fact that he, was physically strong and all of those things couldn't keep him safe from that, So there are so many assumptions that we make, I think, about the dynamics that are in play there, and yet, and all of those things are the opposite of recognizing the dignity and the humanity, which of course go together, particularly for JB. And I think if we have an understanding of what justice can mean in those contexts, it involves a restoration of one's sense of self and a repudiation of any of those kinds of behaviours and a denunciation of them. And that's why there are links with law. Because particularly like in the criminal law, it isn't just about punishment. You know, it's also about denunciation. It's also about rehabilitation and preventing people from continuing that conduct, and all kinds of different things are part of sentencing aims. So they're not actually inconsistent. There is a lot of congruence between theological understandings of justice and so-called secular understandings of justice, and they're not. They don't have to be seen as inconsistent, and they should rightly be seen as, you know, being part of potentially the same response. And as I said, a lot of people will decide not to go down that road, not to bring criminal charges against someone, etc. And there are many, many reasons for that, and that's fine. But the idea that it's not Christian to do so should never be one of those reasons.
Yeah. My one modification on Bryden's thing, rather than consent being an expression of autonomy, I would say consent is an expression of mutuality. I am asking you, will you enter into this? And the other person saying, yes, I will. So it is an invitation to mutuality. And I think that the nature of overcoming violence is that one doesn't demand or function in an autonomous kind of way without regard for the other.
Yeah,
so my sense is
I
that
think,
there is a possibility. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think the way that I've read Bryden's question is not on the part of the husband, but on the part of the wife. Right?
It would need to be both ways. I mean, if
consent,
consent only works if both people are consenting. Otherwise, it's not consent.
I think we're talking about two things. I think we're talking about two things.
Okay.
Right? If we're talking about identifying whether or not something is consensual, then there does have to be consent from both parties. You're right.
Right.
The wife does have autonomy, and yet so there will be. I'm just trying to. I think I might have misread the question, or we may be talking about it from two different sides. But it is, consent doesn't remove autonomy, is my point.
No, consent means that if I say no, I don't want to, then I have the right to say no. Consent implies I can say yes or I can say no, and I have the dignity. You grant me the dignity to say yes or no, and I grant you the dignity to ask, but I can say yes or no.
Yeah,
otherwise it's just a demand.
I think it is autonomy. Or it's more. I would say it's more that the fact it's the fact of someone's personhood that enables them to either choose yes or no. And if you are respecting the dignity of that person, then you will hear their yes or no. And then in those decisions, something will become consensual or not.
I didn't follow that.
Look, thank you, you two. I love this little one because I knew it's a curveball. It was designed as a curveball. So I'm honest enough to say it's a curveball. Because
sorry.
No. So often we use language in very specific cultural contexts, and often in America, consent is equivalent to choice. My body, my choice. Okay, now these are slogans, and they're weaponized, to use the language of this morning. And consent often is seen as equivalent. It's my choice. How dare you trample on my, I'm going to use your naughty word, Jenny, sorry, autonomy. Now, I'm actually trying to say, hold on to both words. Just park both words, both consent and autonomy, and the cultural specific context in which they're thrown around, because it's often thrown around. Back up the bus, your lovely word earlier on, undergirding. What is driving the language? And even the word autonomy, for me, is quote unquote, problematic. Because the word autos means self, equals in our context, my individual right to punch you on the nose if you jump in front of me, because you really shouldn't do that, and I'm telling you, you shouldn't do that. Do you hear the distinction I'm making here? I'm punching you on the nose. You jumped in front of me, and you shouldn't have done that. That's what we call taking the law into your own hands. But that's my right, because these undergirding assumptions of any conversation are very, very slippery. Now, I love the fact that Jenny immediately thinks that consensual is not a transactional thing. It's a mutual, yes, I will honor you if you honor me. I will honor you if you... No, there's a condition wrapped into that form of it, you see?
Yeah.
Again, a curveball, sorry, because you didn't say that, did you? You said consensual is already relational. And absolutely, I would agree. Because the problem is, as Christians, we don't, back up the bus. As Western Christians, we start with the individual. It's my salvation. I'm making my communion, and I'm not going to talk to the other lady at the other end of the church. That's an Anglican problem, by the way. We are all individually making our communion, i.e., we're taking the bread and the wine. So I think we've got to be that's the point of my question. That's all. To say the language of consent and the language of freedom and the language of autonomy has to be always, I use the word, parsed. We have to actually get into what they're really trying to say. And the language that we use is differently heard by different audiences.
Yeah.
That's all.
And that is exactly, I think, why this part of the conversation has got Marty going, okay, Jen, I heard what you said. What did you just say? Right? Because I think, and that's partly because what I'm bringing to this conversation is an awareness of the way in which not just sexual violence, but all domestic violence was sanctioned by the church and sanctioned by the law for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the way in which consent functions in terms of legal definitions and all of that kind of thing. And so when I read your question, I'm starting from, and again, I'm only talking about husbands and wives, but it can happen either way, but I'm starting on the wife's side. Whereas I think what Marty was saying in relation to consent, if I'm hearing Marty rightly, is that the husband would be paying attention to the whole issue of consent because by definition, he is wanting something that is mutual.
Yes.
And that is a very, very different type of approach to a sexual relationship than the kind that I'm mindful of when we're looking at, but hang on a minute, how do we define consent? Because most conversations around, hang on a minute, how do we define consent, come from a place of a starting point of what traditionally Christian men, particularly in evangelical traditions, but I suspect in other traditions as well. And I'm talking traditionally, I'm not talking about what the gospel actually is, but a teaching which in which a starting point is entitlement to the other person, right? Particularly sexual entitlement, but entitlement to the other person. And that can affect, and that's the death knell of mutuality right there. So,
and consent, I'd say consent and entitlement are those are opposed ideas.
Yeah, but I don't think that if we are talking about the word consent and meaning within that discussion the consent of both parties, then that's a different discussion to if we're just talking about the consent of the husband over here, don't know whether you can see, and the consent of the wife over here, because both need to consent, otherwise it's not mutual.
It's not consent,
and so on. Well,
no,
I don't actually think that it's necessarily useful in the context of a discussion about marital rape to talk about consent in one holistic sense. Because if we do that, we lose the fact that both people are equally able to participate or not there, rather than it actually is just this generic consent that was given at the start, and now that means that, you know, you have to essentially oblige the other person.
And I would say my definition of consent, and the way that I've heard it used in university context around here, is that consent is the current, this night, this place, this time, and not outside of that. And every time, I mean, this is very clear what is told to college students. Every time you must ask consent.
And that's
so that's the way I'm hearing it being used.
But that's part of the importance. And I mean, I say this with all due respect to the law, but the law doesn't go far enough, right? If we go back to what I don't mean the law in relation to sexual offending. The law in relation to sexual offending basically needs changing all kinds of different places, and that's a different conversation. But I'm thinking back to a comment you made earlier, Marty, about contractual obligations versus covenantal obligations.
Yes.
Right. And I think, with all due respect to the law, if we're only thinking about the law, then we have only got one very small part of the conversation, when the question that's on the table is, how do we recognise the dignity and the humanity of the person that is in front of me, and view them as a full and whole person, you know, in their own right, who is now also in this you know, beautiful way a part of me. But so I remember you were talking about the fact that, you know, under a covenant, obligations are unconditional, right? And the obligations of love are actually harder than the obligations of law. The example JB used to always give was, you know, when I marry my wife, the contract would say don't commit adultery. If it was a contract, the contract would say don't commit adultery, but the covenant says love this woman and keep on loving this woman, and when you think you're done loving this woman, love her some more. You know, he didn't put it quite like that, but you know, the obligations of love are much harder to keep than the obligations of law, and that's partly why we want to default to contract, so that we can go, have I done enough now? Excellent. You know, because our pride plays into that. And in the same way, like if a couple were approaching the question of mutuality in their marriage from the point of, how can I ensure that I maximize my respect and elevate the dignity and honor this person as much as I possibly can, then you know, we would see far less of any kind of mistreatment, let alone domestic violence, and let alone sexual violence. It is the opposite of a covenant.
Yeah. Alan would have a variation on what you're saying. He would say, if I'm going to the Netherlands and my wife says to me, if you go to the Netherlands and if you see some woman there and if you do something, then buddy, you better not come back. That the fear of contract makes it not very powerful. It just keeps you in a kind of a fearful. But if she says, Alan, you're going to the Netherlands, I know you love me. I know you may be tempted. And I just want you to know that no matter what you do, I will be here waiting for you. I want you to come back fully honest and open to me. He says, which do you think is more powerful for me to stay faithful to my wife? And so that's the power of covenant, is that it actually gives us what it is that we need to maintain the faithfulness and the covenant love, and to not be abusive to the other, because it has the fullness of our humanity at work. We are not breaking ourselves apart, disintegrating, so to speak. The covenant integrates us into the life of love.
The gospel goes much further than legal definitions.
Yes,
you know? The gospel absolutely encompasses the legal definitions, but it goes much beyond them.
Yeah. To say that the very nature of contract is that it's fear-based. Contract is always worried about what might go wrong and wants to protect oneself in the face of something going wrong. Whereas covenant is always based in love. A biblical form of covenant, the JBTF form, is always based in love and asks what is good for the other as well as good for myself in the nature of our relationship. And so those are two radically different paradigms. The nature of what our legal systems generally have is the fear-based contractual way of functioning. The church has not fully learned yet how to speak covenantese. We haven't learned to really live in such a way that we speak about the God who loves. I mean, Baxter Kruger maybe overstates how badly the church has failed and makes them another problem. And so then we're afraid of being like that. But the nature of really getting the church in its fully loving form and way of being, I mean, that is the vision that I think JB was particularly effective at personally embodying, in a sense. So covenant, when you see somebody embodying it, it is quite profound. We feel contractual people much more profoundly. We feel their fear. We feel them watching and judging and all that. So it's so much more present. But oh, what a relief when you have a covenant person who shows up and promises to be your friend, who promises to be for you and with you in a way that expresses the love of Christ. They're radically different cultures in a sense. And so the question is, this is my particular interest in the church and this essay intended for the forms of church that have so, in a sense, ingrained wanting to be pure and all that, the evangelical, puritanical kind of inclination there. In some ways, it puts us into positions of control and fear that give a kind of power to the system of fear, and hence the contracts and the demanding of a kind of right. I've been good. I've done all that I should do. I have a right to have the fruit of that, so to speak. But it is profoundly self-centered, loses loving, and becomes very consumption-oriented in a sense, right? You consume the other. I wish I was as optimistic as you that people get married for love. I just think so many people, they want something, and maybe it's sex, maybe it's money, maybe it's children, maybe it's security, but I don't know if I'd say more than 10% that I see really get married for something that I would call true love.
Yeah, no, I don't recall in what context, which question I was answering or comment I was responding to when I was talking about people get married for love, right?
Yeah.
People are meant to get married for love, right?
That's
covenant of marriage is a covenant of marriage is meant to involve. Yeah, I agree with Tim's comment. I think you're right. But a covenant is about unconditional love, right?
That's what the church should be teaching. We need to not just say the words, but come to understand it.
And yet, part of the issue, I think, is that if people get married thinking that will bring them love, or thinking that will bring them unconditional love, kind of as part of a package, but their motivations are different. And a lot of people, I think, my observation anyway, particularly depending the era in which they grew up and what the teachings were in the church, lots of teachings about safe sex for marriage, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have that teaching at all, but when that teaching is in a context that operates in a contractual understanding of the gospel, or is interpreted in a disconnected way from the fullness of the gospel, it can absolutely lead to a sense of kind of entitlement and expectation, a little bit like what you were saying before, Marty, particularly in relation to motivations for getting married. I know a lot of people who got married quite young because they thought, I think I'm kind of compatible with this person. I've been dating them. They seem to be really lovely and I think they're okay. And so I'll pick them. And the motivation is, well, I want my sex life, right? Yeah. And so, and there's entitlement on the table if what they have been taught, either the blokes or the women or both, but my guess is particularly the blokes from some men I've spoken to, they get kind of told, wait until you're married, wait until you're married, wait until you're married. And part of the carrot of that, if you like, is then you will get all the sex you want. And so then if they don't get all the sex they want because, their wife is saying no, It creates confusion and resentment and various other things. But all of it, can you hear even in my example for how to understand that motivation? There's nothing personal in that.
No.
Sex is not a reward, you know, and so that can be a big problem. So absolutely people can get married for reasons other than love, but when they do, it's not necessarily a recipe for disaster, because maybe people can, you know, the love can come over time, or who knows, but it's certainly a real problematic element for people to be able to firstly function as grown adults together rather than just be still behaving like children, but also in their sense of selfishness. TF in his radio address about violence and what causes violence, and I don't have the page up in front of me, unfortunately, but he said something like,
have a copy of it though, and if we could get a copy of that, if you have a digital form.
In as much as the I've got the chapter up, but I don't have that page open, but he said something like, in as much as violence in society is caused by what lies in the human heart and the selfishness and the turning inwards, you know, then covenant is a corrective to that. And yet if when we marry we're expecting something other than, or we're motivated by something other than the love that we feel for that person, and I mean, of course it's going to be imperfect and incomplete, and you know, none of us love well all the time and all of that, but if our motivation is essentially selfish and turned inward, whether that's I want status, I want someone to look after me when I'm old, I want sex, I want whatever it might be, then we are setting ourselves up for a contractual style of relating in a relationship that the church deems to be a covenant, and then say, oh, well, because it's a covenant, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And we're giving it a sacredness that actually isn't present in the outworking of that relationship. And that in itself can make it hard for people to know what to do, and, you know, whether it's okay to divorce and all of those kinds of things. And we get caught up in all the technicalities and bring in all of the rules, and people's personhood winds up destroyed along the way. You know, which
I say people are unconditional in their love until they get married, and then there's this huge download that happens. Now we're married. Now I expect this of you. And expect is just another word for the law and the conditions, right?
Yeah.
So we're beautifully unconditional until that day. And I say, you know, the best thing you can do is dating is be exactly who you are and beg the other person to be exactly who they are, so you can get an authentic picture of who they are every day. Highs, lows, authenticity is a much better grounding. Right, and I see your hand up there.
Well, thank you. I mean, I got a massive education from a parishioner about 7 or 8 years ago. I was in this church for over 12 years, interim priest in charge for 18 months. So, you know, kind of up to my hilt. Now, she's Indian, and she was of a previous generation. She's now probably 65 years of age. So this took place when she was in her late 50s. Here's the conversation. You Westerners, okay, she's generalizing. You Westerners get married because you fall in love. Then you fall out of love and you get divorced. And then she said, we Indians, and she had a young daughter aged 19, and she was busy kind of, you know, eyeing all the young men around the place who are also Indian. We Indians get married and then we learn to love. And I'm afraid I've sat with that, because yes, a lot of their marriages are arranged marriages, and I have met couples who have successful arranged marriages as Indians, and I've met couples who have arranged marriages and there's a degree of dysfunctionality, shall I politely put it. So we have a very cross-cultural congregation, by the way, you know. So I have to quietly say, let's again get back to the roots of these scenarios. And it was a massive conversation for me. It was less than 3 minutes, and it stuck with me for 6-7 years. So I toss it into the ring, Jenny, for you to consume. Sorry, that's a naughty, nasty word.
Oh no, I take your point, Bryden, and I mean I know several Christian couples who had arranged marriages, and the way that was set up traditionally, and the parents put a lot of time and effort into looking at compatibility and potential friendship and all of those things, because even I, as a single person, know that without that, any marriage is doomed, right? So, and they did absolutely, commit, and part of that committing was learning to love and so on. But see, that's where we need to ask whether or not love is just a feeling, or love is also a commitment to the way that we actually treat each other, right? And so I wouldn't exclude potentially arranged marriages from an understanding of marriage, which involves covenantal marriage, which involves unconditional love, because that's not just the romance that fades and all of that stuff. It's also about how we choose to treat each other and the partnership that we commit to, and still, recognizing the personhood of that person and recognizing the dignity that they have and so on, which is why TF's understanding of personhood and the approach that he takes to his anthropology and all of those things is so profoundly helpful there, along with the work that JB's done. Because again, then, in whatever covenant relationship we are in, whether it's a covenant of marriage, whether it's the covenant that we're just talking about, the new covenant, our obligations to each other in terms of the way that we treat each other. I have an obligation to treat everyone with love, and I'm not married to any of them. And how that looks in different contexts, of course, will play out differently. But when we are, giving each other the dignity and the respect that we are due as children of God, that also includes being mindful of those relationships and relating to each other according to, who we are in the context of those. A complete side issue, but I know culturally it's probably different in many countries, but it's not at all unusual, like in Australia anyway, for people to have friendships of both genders, irrespective of whether those people are married or not or whatever. And I mean, I've lived in shared houses quite often. I don't now, but I've lived in shared houses quite often where there's, men and women and whatever. And sometimes we get comments about, oh my goodness, how can you do that? And part of the query about that was, well, how do you manage to not just try to partner up all the time? And I thought, well, why would I partner up with that person? They're literally just a friend. We can relate that way, and if they're married, then by definition, they are a package deal. And so your friendship is with the couple and that kind of stuff. And so it still works. But I know some people who say opposite gender friendships aren't possible. But if we're starting with, respecting each other and treating each other well, then that works for good. It's not just about preventing violence and just about minimizing harm, even though, of course, we need to do that. All of it flows out of who we understand each other to be and who we understand ourselves to be,
Well, to say that, the outcome of the appropriate life of the church is that we do learn to have dignity and respect. Maybe communities of churches could covenant to watch out for one another. I mean, maybe we draw our covenant thinking too small, and even covenant with parts of towns, at least where we live. In counseling, I do a lot of work of just getting people to make agreements with one another. This, to really be clear that both of you are willing to do this, but to say that is we've talked about the ongoing obligations of love, is that we want to be as clear as possible. And so, to say, I'll do the dishes, alternate weeks or whatever, it is not an obligation of force or contract. It is two people who care saying, how do we take care of each other? And so if we worked more at getting agreements based in love, then I think people would feel the satisfaction of that being with others relationally actually frees life up, and we can be fully who we are. And when we don't want to do something, we can ask others to be our covenant partners, whether we're married to them or not. But it is the character of friendship. And so domestic violence is where friendship is lost. And so Jesus' statement, I call you friends, is to say that the very character of what it is that Jesus calls for generally as well as for marriages is that there be a dimension of the friendship that Jesus brings. And your statement that we need to know we're children of God, which makes us brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
And so,
sorry, kid.
go
I
ahead.
think that's a really important an important point. I think we do cast the net, so to speak, or our understanding of covenant too small. And when we do that, that affects friendship, that affects all kinds of things. There was a comment earlier about there being a friendship deficit, particularly for males. And I think, and it's probably true, especially if there's not an understanding of how to be a fully loving human being and that kind of stuff. So there's a couple of there's a question up about, is it possible for people to stop abusing and become psychologically healthy and those kinds of things? And yeah, I mean, I think it is potentially, but that will depend completely on the question of whether that person is prepared to face themselves and face what's actually going on in themselves that is leading to that kind of behavior. And it's harder to do that if we don't understand, if we're looking at concepts, contractually and legalistically and so on. And I think, the gospel frees us if we're looking at, love and justice, and we're not losing sight of that totality. Then it actually frees us to, face the depravity of what's going on in our hearts that is leading us to treat another person this way, and to do that work and to allow for, the restoration of our own humanity. Because if a person is violent, that actually affects their own, humanity as well. It's a great question. And so it is possible to do that. But I think it becomes harder to do that if we're kind of whitewashing over everything and treating and not seeing the depth. If we're not seeing violence as an onto-relational injustice, it's actually paradoxically harder to really deal with what's needed for restoration on both sides. Now, that may or may not lead to reconciliation of the relationship. But properly understood, that unconditional love, forgiveness, unconditional repentance, and doing that work of repentance, which involves the restoration and taking responsibility and bringing justice and all of those things, that in itself can be a part of that person's own journey back to emotional health. And they can receive back their humanity as well, which is something that JB talks about in that model. So yes, it is possible, but it'll be the choice of that person whether they want to engage in that kind of process. And there's
whether they really get the gospel, if they really get the Jesus who comes, that repentance is the logic that flows from that. I mean, that's the Torrancean order, right? When people really meet Jesus, repentance is possible. If you try and do it yourself, you're probably going to fail.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I really do hear in your chapter, and we'll kind of wind up with this because we're past 3 here in my time zone. The nature of the church in this, I think, really understanding the character of God, the character of covenant, the character of church, the character of family. At every level, there are huge possibilities. If we just go to the problems, then we're likely to get bound up with every situation with its own boundary. So what you're doing of laying a foundation, the covenanting God comes and lays the foundation of the possibility of the hope for humanity and marriage and churches. And so it is the repentance of returning to that God and not conforming to the contract ways of the world that live from fear and control and all those other things. That is really the hope. It's a gospel thing. It's an evangelical thing, because that's what evangelical means, right?
Yes, it is an evangelical thing, and that's actually how JB finishes his model, like reconciliation. Whether that's reconciliation of the marriage or just reconciliation in relation to these people receive their humanity back, right? Yeah. That reconciliation requires the forgiveness to be received by the perpetrator in unconditional repentance. And if that, which predicates, the healing that is needed and the restoration of their safety as being a safe person who can respect and dignify the other and all of that kind of stuff. And so that is important then. And so I guess what that means is it's possible for us to restore a wife by affirming that dignity and that safety and that need for justice and the truth of the fact that, her worth is far more than that. And that restoration is independent of the question of whether or not the husband is going to do his own deep work on that and receive forgiveness and do that in repentance. So it leaves us, that potential for deep healing and restoration on both sides, and that in itself is actually an expression of justice. When we understand justice theologically and not just legally, that in itself is a huge part of experiencing justice. So the justice that we're talking about theologically, it can involve the justice of a courtroom, but thank God it doesn't have to, particularly because there are all sorts of problems with justice in a courtroom. But it's possible to experience justice whether one actually uses the criminal justice system or not, through the fullness of the gospel message. So I think that in itself is something very, very significant that comes out from this kind of understanding of the gospel, and the work of the Torrances is very, very helpful in that regard.
Perfect. Amen and amen. We will love to do justly and love mercy, and we'll walk away from this conversation hopefully with humility as we walk with God. But thank you for this and for the chapter, and I hope people will indeed buy the book and read and continue to dialogue with you about what you're discovering and what they're discovering, because hopefully these will be generative conversations that we will keep looking at those things. But thank you for being here today. To everyone else for being
Marty.
here today. I think it's a good. And we hardly looked at the material because there was so much vibrant stuff in the air. It's like the fire is burning. Just keep throwing wood on, and we'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, happy to chat more about the justice stuff another time if that would work.
Well, we can certainly set
the thesis will be in a couple of weeks, so I'll there'll be a whole nother conversation there.
Good. Well, we will do that. And if you have texts, the text that you talked about, the radio talk, you have that text. Is that right?
I do, but I think it was I'm not sure. I think it was within a journal that has a subscription to it. But JB's model of reconciliation, if I just take a couple more minutes, JB's model of reconciliation is set out in a chapter in a book, but it's also pretty much the same text is in some unpublished notes, which Jim Chaucer's put up, or gave to Kerry and got put up in the fellowship's bibliography. So it's civil and political reconciliation in Northern Ireland and South Africa. I don't, off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact title, but those several paragraphs that I draw from are in that document as well. So that can be accessed that way. That's freely available.
Let's do a session in the future dealing with those. Kerry usually can get me those kinds of things that lie behind it. He says just copy it and take off the part that has it on there, and then you can post it, or at least provide it for the conversation. So let's do that.
Those few paragraphs about holding justice and freedom and so on together as the anatomy of reconciliation, those are there in that document.
We'll try not to be unjust.
I'll post the title in the forum.
Yeah, we'll try not to be unjust to TF in using his works, but justly loving him by getting the word out that he has to say. Absolutely. Very good. Well, thank you all. Blessings on you, Jenny. May the day have some energy to it, even though you got up early. And it's Friday for you, so happy Friday to you.
Thanks very much.
Very good. And to everyone as well, thank you.
Okay, blessing.
Bye-bye.